that when the extension of our interest, much less our capacity, goes beyond our easily identifiable enemies to include what had heretofore been our easily identifiable friends. When we begin spying on the people and the leaders of countries about whom there can be little doubt about their loyalty and commitment to us and our way of life, we find ourselves in the midst of a challenging controversy for us as citizens and for government and policy leaders. This began, of course, or at least it began to be revealed further in the middle of last year when The Guardian began publishing the revelations of Edward Snowden, a former NSA contractor, about the United States' effort in cooperation with the so-called Five Eyes group, the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, to spy on our close friends and allies. In fact, it was revealed we had been doing so for years. We spied on summits, including, one might almost certainly say, the G20 here in Pittsburgh. We spy on their delegations. We listen to their communications. We spy on their private phone calls. We know what their leaders, for example, of Brazil, Israel, and Germany are saying. And this all, as it always does, has now come out. In a recent speech to the Bundestag, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that this has done enormous damage to the trust between allies if, quote, everything is done that is technically possible. She shouldn't feel so bad. Maybe she's just offended that she was not the first German chancellor to be spied on, because it was subsequently revealed that we also spied on Gerhard Schroeder. This undermining of trust is perhaps the broadest impact of what has happened, but it is not the only one. And we will today consider some of those. What is the impact on trade, on the ongoing trade negotiations? What is the impact on the ability of these long-term allies to cooperate and share data on key issues that they both face, that they all face, including security issues like terror, nuclear weapons, issues of the Middle East, and others? Alternatively, can the allies come up with a protocol, a development of a norm, President Obama has called it, for not spying on each other? From the United States perspective, has this so damaged U.S. credibility that no matter what President Obama or any president promise, it will have no credibility, because it was revealed that we were doing this and have continued to do this? There's also, from the European perspective, the issue of what one of our panelists today called the world's digital hegemon, that is us. Will it push the Europeans to develop their own data policy and data protection to such an extent that it will drive a wedge between the allies with significant domestic consequences? Some of which, and it doesn't take very long to think about this, have clear commercial implications that affect the largest companies operating here and Europe. That's only a few of the issues that need to be addressed. To help us guide us through these questions, we have, and by we I mean Allison, collected a fantastic panel well qualified to address these questions. My colleague in England, Professor Anthony Glees, is director of Buckingham University's University Center for Security and Intelligence Studies and professor of politics at that university. He is what I call a public intellectual. He is someone who's been very much involved in the UK's Parliament's development of policies on the question of security, especially as it regards to privacy and its relationship to security. He has published on this topic, including an article entitled The Future of Intelligence Studies, and has directly commented in his blog on The Guardian's revelations, about which we will talk today. Joining us from Berlin is Dr. Annegret Bendiek, who is the Deputy Head of External Relations at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, German Institute of International and Security Affairs in Berlin. She was a member of the expert group on Policy Lab Cyber Security, established by the German Foreign Office, and she is currently a Bosch Public Policy Fellow. She too has published on this topic, including most recently on European cybersecurity within a global multi-state structure in European Foreign Affairs Review. We also have a representative from another German foundation, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation here in Washington, Pia Bungarten, who is the representative of that foundation to the United States and Canada. She's an expert on transatlantic relations and initiator of the Global Atlanticist Network, a bipartisan network of German and U.S. lawmakers who get together to deal with key policy issues, and I dare say this will be one of them. From our partner university at the University of Texas, Professor Ami Pedahzur, who is the Arnold Chaplik Professor in Israel and Diaspora Studies and Professor of Government at the University of Texas. He has published on a wide range of activities. Those most relevant for us today is his book on the Israeli Secret Services and the Struggle Against Terrorism, and a recent article on social network analysis in the study of terrorism and political violence. And finally, my colleague here at the University of Pittsburgh, seated beside me, David Harris, Distinguished Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law and also Associate Dean for Research, who has focused in his publications and his research in a wide range of issues. All are united by the theme of the intersection between technology and humans, and technology and policy, including, for example, racial profiling, law enforcement and intelligence gathering in Muslim and immigrant communities. And he has what I think qualifies as the best title of all the CVs I've received, an article on the contemporary meaning of Korematsu, Liberty Lies in the Hearts of Men and Women. We won't have a chance to ask him about that today, but I will quiz him about it later. If indeed liberty does lie in the hearts of minds and men, we have discovered that policy sometimes intrudes on those hearts and minds. And I would like to begin the discussion today by asking our panelists to address what you might call the "what's all the fuss about" question. Let me phrase it this way. Can anyone really be shocked by these revelations? Can anyone really, with any credibility, pretend to be stunned and even embarrassed by it? Haven't we always been spying on each other, listening to each other's phone calls? What's new about this scandal? The floor is open.
Well, I am not shocked.
Okay.
I believe that most nations do this. It was interesting in your introduction that you talked about spying on enemies, but what about friends? There are national interests at stake. We look at the communications of our enemies, of course, and our allies, of course, too, because we want policy insight into what they're doing. We want to know, for instance, if the leader of a country publicly says this, is actually intending that. I don't believe that despite the public outcry over this, that anybody within any of the senior levels of government, and I have to include Chancellor Merkel, is actually surprised by what's going on. I applaud her sentiment that we should not just do everything that technology enables us to do, but the history of this sort of thing indicates that that nations will spy. They will spy to the limits of their technological and human capabilities, and it's only a question of what they can do.
Professor Pedahzur.
Well, I fully agree with this statement, and I think that this is the point that, it's almost obvious that there is nothing new under the sun here. And I think that basically it goes back to International Relations 101. When Israel was spying on the U.S., the U.S. threw the spy in jail and is very unlikely to get out of there. The U.S. is spying on Israel. We know it for decades. So it basically means that even best friends can spy on one another. It only depends who is stronger. Those who are stronger have the right to do it. The weaker party has less of a right to perpetrate such an act. What is important, and I think that you brought it up, is that this is going to become even more prevalent. We're not talking about governments anymore. We are talking about highly capable commercial interests and private entities that can actually surveil and collect information, and both from within the government and as you said, from the private sector. So I think that this is something that is going to become, we'll have to take it for granted that it happens, and start thinking about a world in which there are very few secrets, and that most of what we know, our enemies or competitors also know.
Dr. Bendiek, is that the way it's seen in Germany?
Yeah, thank you first of all for the invitation to be part here of the panel, of this very interesting panel discussion. So I would say from a German perspective, yes, of course, rationally speaking, we know that even under friends and even under allied partners, we spy on each other. But the quality is a little bit different. We are living in a digital revolution. The US is here the digital hegemon, and therefore the US has more capacities to spy on others than the allies have. And therefore there's a kind of asymmetric situation here. And so, and here I would say the ancient Greek historian Thucydides' conviction comes into play, that the strong is doing what it can, and the weak suffer what they have to suffer. And so in this situation, I would say that the Europeans are in a weaker position. But I would say it cannot be the goal among allies to spy on each other, also taking into account that we would like to sign a transatlantic free trade and investment partnership. That is contradictory, and therefore I think we are finding ourselves in a stalemate situation.
If what each of you say is true, that no one could be surprised, even in Germany where there's been a bit of professed outrage, then is what we're seeing simply a demonstration of domestic pandering? That is, domestic leaders, especially Chancellor Merkel, is just playing this up when everybody really knows, wink, wink, nod, nod, there's nothing new. Professor Glees.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank you too for what is, to me, a first to take part in a conference like this. I think the first thing to say is we're in a very serious place at the moment, and your conference is very timely because there's real evidence as far as intelligence is concerned of growing dissonance between the United States and indeed the United Kingdom on the one hand, and the rest of Europe led by Germany on the other. So we're in a very serious place, and people like me who believe in Europe and European integration, and they do it because they're very aware of the kind of Europe that lurched into the catastrophe of the First World War 100 years ago, can see nothing worse than continental Europe falling out with the United Kingdom and falling out with the United Kingdom and the United States of America. So somebody's got to blow the whistle. Now, I'm very surprised by what Frau Merkel has said. I'm surprised that she appears to have been ignorant at what intelligence has been gathered about her country. I'm surprised she wants to establish a for Europeans only digital web internet. That's precisely the sort of thing that I don't think should happen. Yes, the British spy, the American spy, so do the Germans, and so do the French. And I think we need to be very serious about this. We need to understand why we do it. We need to understand how the public can be reassured. We need to understand how the New York Times, how the Guardian has seriously misrepresented what is going on. Not everybody is being spied on. This is not a Stasi-like surveillance operation. It's totally different. Yes, we are in a new situation because the new technology makes it easier to intercept communications. But as everybody said, this has gone on really since Native American Indians sent smoke signals to each other. Communications will always be intercepted, and during the Second World War, the interception of German communications and their decoding at Bletchley Park saved many people's lives, and if it had been more successful earlier on, maybe even more lives would have been saved in the terrible slaughter that was the Second World War. So we need to be real. We need to understand what this is about. And I think, yes, maybe we need to come to some kind of agreement as to what is legitimate intelligence activity and so on. But the bottom line is this. Public security in a liberal democracy is an absolute good. Privacy, total privacy, is not an absolute good. The law does not make acts committed in private legal if those acts are in themselves criminal. We expect our intelligence agencies to keep us safe. We need to give them the tools they have to do that. And we really should move the debate on, in my view, to understanding how intelligence works. One final point, if I may. The only wrongdoing that the New York Times, that the Guardian newspaper, that Edward Snowden revealed is the wrongdoing of the New York Times, the Guardian newspaper, and above all, Edward Snowden. There's been no convincing evidence that anybody's laws have been broken. And Frau Merkel should have taken the advice of her own Secret Service and attended to the security of her own mobile phone. She didn't change the number, I'm told, for 7 years. So that would be my view from Britain. It keeps us safe.
I want to get Pia Bungarten in, since you have pointedly raised the issue of Frau Merkel, and I want to hear more about the German point of view. Pia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
can hear
fine,
me?
Thank you.
Fine.
Yes.
Well, thank you first of all for hosting this, for the initiative, for bringing all of us together. I think it's exactly the kind of thing that we need. I would like to maybe go back to the idea of how surprised were we, how outraged are we? And it seems to be sometimes a little bit, the people in the US were not really surprised. People here are used to big data in many different contexts. We just witnessed President Obama being reelected with the help of big data mining and so on. And on the other hand, you have supposedly the people in Germany who are outraged, and that means they are not taking into consideration, how the world operates. My sense is that we actually have a lot more in common in this context. I did sort of a little private survey with friends, colleagues, people I met, and asking Americans, how on a range of 1 to 10, how surprised were they? And they said, 2 out of 10. But how outraged were they? And they would come up with numbers like 6, 7, and 8. So there are many Americans too who are deeply uncomfortable in light of what has been revealed. And I take what Professor Glees has said. I think that's very important for us to consider. What can we make of the things that have been revealed? But as you know, here in the US, there is a very important debate. The president is involved, having asked a commission. The Congress has come up with already at least two different laws, very different. The courts are coming up with different court decisions. So there is a very vibrant debate here about the degree to which the current situation as established really is beneficial. Does it serve the interest? And what I find most interesting here, and I think that's something that Germans need to take into consideration when they think, Germans tend to think we are the only ones who really stand up for privacy. I think there is a very vibrant debate here in the US, and US critics, both in the Congress, in the administration, in the press, in the courts, are really disputing two core things that the NSA has claimed for itself. The first was the NSA said we act in accordance with US laws, which I think is true, but it's constitutional. And one judge already has said, we doubt that. It could be that this actually violates the Fourth Amendment. And the second claim is that it serves security. And there are now many voices in the US that say, well, we don't really see the evidence when we look at terrorism cases. What we see is that traditional police efforts and methods might be more effective than all of this bulk data collection. So the point for me is that instead of dividing us up, here are the US and others who are more accepting and see this as necessary, and the Germans being outraged and in favor of privacy. I think there's more commonality in the debate on both sides. And what we need to understand is that it is a shared issue. The question of privacy in the digital age is a shared issue. It cannot be solved once. It's not temporary. We need a shared debate, which goes to another question that you will raise on coming up with shared norms. But we need a discourse on this, and we need to understand that these are issues that are important and affect people on both sides of the Atlantic. It's not that we're all that much divided. So that's my first point on this.
Well, fortunately, as we sink into the legal morass, we have a lawyer right here at the University of Pittsburgh who will offer some thoughts on this.
I guarantee no exits from the legal morass. I would say that Pia's got a very good point here. There is more in common than maybe we realize. For Americans, the current era of heavy surveillance really begins with the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. And I can remember very clearly in that frame of time how the Patriot Act was passed with very little opposition, how our Attorney General testified in our Senate that those who stood in the way of government and gave and objected to this sort of government surveillance were really just aiding the terrorists, in his words. And in that frame, the American mindset was sort of forged for this era. It was do what you have to do to keep us safe. There was a lot of fear. And those of us who were among the dissenting voices, and I count myself as one, said, now, there are limits to everything, and you don't want to set government up to be in a position to do absolutely everything that their technology allows them to do. And yet that is what the law does. And Americans now are outraged, to use Pia's words, because they are surprised that this effort is not focused on the bad guys. It is basically an effort, as the folks have described it over here, to bring the entire haystack in so the needle can be found, instead of focusing on those who are the best candidates to do us harm. And make no mistake, we have real enemies. We and all the other countries represented around these tables, we have enemies, and we need to do what we have to keep ourselves safe. But now Americans are outraged because they didn't believe it was going to be about them. They thought it would be about those guys, those people who look different or talk different or live somewhere else. So that's why we have this discussion now in this country, and there is real discussion about how far the government should go. It is worth mentioning, though, that all of the things that the NSA has done have been done at the request, at the direction of other agencies within the executive branch of our government. In other words, they don't just make up assignments for themselves. Somebody or some agency, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, comes to them and tasks them and tells them, we need this. And they say, well, we think we can do that. We'll go right to it. So we cannot isolate on the NSA, I don't think. I think this goes quite a bit deeper, and it forces us to ask very difficult questions about what we want to do in surveillance terms versus our own privacy and freedom.
Professor Glees.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say very briefly that I don't think we are all in agreement. I don't think we do all share this outrage. I'm afraid I didn't get the name of your distinguished colleague to your left, because he comes up on my screen as simply UCIS 4217.
That's not my name.
For NSA purposes, that's his name.
But the moment he says that there is outrage, Americans are outraged, I'm perfectly prepared to accept that the culture in the United States is different, that Americans value privacy and all these things more than the continental Europeans. I also accept, as did General Michael Hayden, whom I listened to last week. He was in Oxford giving a couple of lectures, and the public lectures. And he said, and I think he's right, it was a damn stupid thing to bug Frau Merkel's telephone. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but now, on reflection, it was a damn stupid thing to do because it has generated a wedge between two people who should be very close together. So, you know, there is something of a sliding scale here. But people communicate, terrorists communicate. And if I may say so, you are pushing the theory that we are all being spied on. And that is not true. We are not all being spied on. Data is being collected. And you shake your head, but did you ever object to the postman looking at the address on your envelope when he delivered the mail to your house rather than to your neighbor's house? Of course not. Intelligence services have been intercepting communications since the dawn of time. The public has not been outraged. They've understood this is to keep them safe. And we have the word of our intelligence chiefs in the United States and the United Kingdom that the terrorists have gone quiet. For example, terrorists are no longer using Gmail, thanks to Edward Snowden. This man is not a national hero. He's a crook, and you ought to get your hands on him.
Okay, that's another panel. We'll do that next week. We'll do that next week, and I won't be chair. Professor Pedahzur.
Echo Professor Glees here, because I think that there is a game of smoke and mirrors here. What we heard from the news media was somewhat sensationalist, because part of the, now many people think that we are all being spied on, every chatter, every conversation that we are holding, and this is absolutely false. And I think that it was just a way to push the story forward and make it a little bit vague so people would freak out and buy more newspapers. And this is really significant because the information that is being collected is essential for various purposes, including network analysis, etc. It's also important to remember that prior to 9/11, the US intelligence community had full information about the plot. The problem was that there was too much information, and before it was processed and it was dealt with, the attacks took place. What we see today, and I think that the Western world is highly successful in intercepting terrorism, is actually very close collaboration among intelligence agencies. And they're doing, I think that while politicians get upset and the public is getting, freaked out, the intelligence agencies are doing a very good work in sharing information and utilizing various tools that they are applying, including in some parts of the world, tools that, most Western citizens are not going to be happy with. But I think that terrorism here is a pretext to something bigger. Knowledge is power. And as long as one actor is going to have the capability to attain information, this information is going to be attained. Because once you have the power to do it and you don't do it, you will always be concerned that others are going to do it. I don't think that there are ways, studying a little bit the intelligence communities in the Western world, that you can actually regulate it or introduce legal norms that would prevent them from doing it, not domestically, but on the international arena.
Before we return to the international aspects, which I want to, especially this question of the ability to regulate it, I want to ask what seems to me to be the following question. Both you, Professor Pedahzur, and Professor Glees have asserted that everyone is not being spied on. It's just the leaders. We are not all being spied on. The source for that assertion are the very agencies who are doing or not doing the spying. Now, if in fact, we didn't know that this was going on, and now it's revealed, how do we know that in 3 years they say, oh, by the way, we are listening to everybody? That is the issue of credibility, both as domestically and internationally. if the only source for that assertion are the very agencies we're worried about? Go ahead. Yes, Professor Pedahzur, you've got the big screen here, so I'm going to let you go for a minute, and then I'm going to turn to Anthony Glees before he jumps out of his chair.
Absolutely. One of the things that you have to remember, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the reason that they don't listen to whatever we say is that they cannot. You need to hire half the United States in order to listen to the other half. And you don't have the resources and manpower. And today, what they have the capability of doing is identifying hubs and identifying lines of communication. And I'm not saying that I trust everything that is being disseminated by the international, by intelligence agencies. I'm just saying that we have to take it. We don't have to be hysterical about it. And we have to know their limitations.
Okay. Professor Glees?
That in different countries, people will rightly have different attitudes. In the United Kingdom, there is no widespread lack of trust in our intelligence community. Far from it. It's the other way around. They've been keeping us safe from Irish terrorism and since 2005 or after 2005 from Islamist terrorism too. And that is because the history is quite different. As I said, Bletchley Park, that is one of the jewels in the British historical crown. You can't say that about the Stasi. You can't say that about the Gestapo. And I would not wish to shove it down the throats of the German people. And it's not for me to lecture American friends about the things that the CIA did 20 or 30 years ago, many of which were both illegal and reprehensible. But where we are today, it seems to me, is that we have to understand we charge these people to do an important job of keeping us safe. Yes, we have to have trust in them. And where there is not trust, trust must be assured. It's interesting that your colleague blames Congress for the Patriot Act, but he doesn't say, oh, the spooks were running wild. In the case of the Federal Republic of Germany, you find no stronger friend of Germany than me. You'll find no greater supporter of a strong Germany in a strong Europe. But basically, the problem of Germany is German weakness in Europe. This is a country that does not want to get militarily involved and then throws up its hands in horror at the idea that intelligence collection goes on. And my final point is this. It is about collection. Surveillance is not collection. Collection is not spying on everybody. It's spying on some people, yes, but not on everybody. And there are not enough intelligence officers in the whole of the world that could spy on the 50 million emails that are sent each day in the United Kingdom. It's just absurd.
Dr. Bendiek, I'd like to return to the issue of U.S. European relations. Angela Merkel has just had a meeting with French president in which she suggests rather pointedly that European states should get together and, as she said, set up a system where they, quote, don't have to go across the Atlantic with emails, build up communications networks within Europe. I have two things disturbing about that. When she makes an offhanded and rather disparaging reference to going across the Atlantic, that's us. That's the basis of the U.S. European relationship. And now is it to be cast into doubt? The second and perhaps more complex issue is that even possible technologically or economically, and what would the consequences be? But I'd like to start with that first aspect of what seems to be a very sour relationship, at least from the point of view of the Germans.
Yeah, first of all, I would say that Germany is, I think, the intelligence cooperation when it comes to rule enforcement and the fight against terrorism is quite good, and it is still working. And I think both sides on a governmental level agree that there is a need for close cooperation and that they should continue this cooperation. I think the problem is a little bit more complex, that in the US, with the Patriot Act, it is still in this frame of terrorism is an essential threat and to its security. And therefore, you need also military means in order to fight international terrorism. And in Germany, it's first of all a measure of appropriate policing measures. And there, checks of balances are coming into place. And here, I think, over the Atlantic, we have different understandings about what's the right checks of balances in fighting terrorism and in the international fight against organized crime and serious crime is. And and here I think that, of course, Germans are very sensitive in this issue, but nevertheless, what Germany is criticizing very much is a close cooperation of what we call public-private partnership, so that the government here in the US has got the possibility to rely on data, on metadata coming from private companies. And here, this whole relationship is connected to this economic domain. And here, I think that Germany has got a strong interest. And what Germany doesn't want to see is that the understanding of public-private partnership, which applies here in the US, will be in the future applied in Europe. And therefore, Germany sees, I think, the necessity to have a strong and very deep debate about the right balance between in how far metadata is collected and can be used for rule enforcement, and it is justifiable. But on the other hand, what are private companies doing then with metadata collected also for their own purposes? And here the economic dimension comes in. And therefore, I think we need to separate this, because we have in the security domain, we have a completely different understanding in the sense that we are not convinced that really military intervention is really the right way to go in fighting terrorism. This can also be seen in the drone debate. But the other part of the story is this economic dimension. And here, I think what Germany would like to see is also in the European Union, when it comes to safe harbor, when it comes to the umbrella agreement on data protection, that there is a clear difference between the economic use and the security use, but also that European data protection standards are coming into play when we are negotiating the Transatlantic Free Trade and Investment Partnership. Because here, for the very first time, we are equal partners in the negotiation. These are two big markets standing in front of each other, and we would like to find a third way, a common way for an integrated market. And it's not any longer the US here in this economic domain, which can really only determine and define the rules of the game. And that is, I think, here the striking point now.
I'm going to ask Pia to follow up, and then I'm going to see if any of our colleagues at partner universities, any of the students there, would want to ask a question. Pia, is it really even conceivable what Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande are talking about, that there could be a Europe-only data system? And aren't we seeing in that a kind of resurrection of the old trade tariff barriers with colossal and catastrophic consequences?
You know, I'm not enough of a technical expert to know, the technical side of that. How much can it be established? what would be the consequences. I'm wary of it. It's very interesting. Some of the polling in Germany shows that that's about 65% of the people polled don't really believe that their personal data would be any more secure if there was such a thing on offer, as what seems to be indicated. This could change, with some clever marketing. If German or European companies say, we have NSA-proof forms of data storage. Right now, all of this language reveals that there's a certain liability. There are people talking about this. As people have pointed out, the NSA can have access to very secure and secret information inside China, and chances are that it would be possible to have the kind of access that people who are now talking about these services seem to think and hope that they can prevent. And it is a complicated question, because yes, indeed, it could, pull the two sides apart that in the context of TTIP are actually talking about the fact how much benefit they can derive from closer cooperation, which kind of makes me think again that when we look at the questions of transatlantic cooperation, we list a whole long list, Iran, Russia, TTIP, Syria, we list all of these. I think on this list, and maybe right now for the time being, even though these other issues like Syria in particular are so horribly pressing, we also really need to put the NSA issue right up there, because it is a question that is on people's minds. I think our discussion today reveals once more that we have a very incomplete understanding of this. We don't really understand how far the secret services, intelligence services are going. And so we respond to what we have understood. Our understanding might be incomplete, but we have to understand that these are issues that the proper balance between security and privacy is an issue that confronts American democracy, that confronts all the democratic states of Europe. It's not something that should drive us apart as if we view the other side as the problem. It is a shared issue which needs shared work on international norms. These technological capacities have outrun our ability to completely understand them. We have a lot of policymakers involved who are not very adept at even using this. But we don't understand this very well. And so that should be even more of a reason for coming together in a shared debate and have an ongoing process, because I don't think we'll find a solution for this once. We will have technical development, and we'll find ourselves again, like, in those wonderful American cartoons where the cartoon character runs over the cliff and finds out only once he's already run over the cliff that he has no firm ground underneath and he goes down. We will have that situation again and again. So we can be very critical. We have to understand that people on both sides of the Atlantic are critical and search for a solution. I was just in a discussion which I thought was very interesting, where the European assumption was, the Americans are all about security, and in Europe we value privacy much more. Well, my understanding of American history tells me that Americans deeply value privacy, and I understand that Europeans deeply value.
Oh, we lost you. We're Pia, I don't know if you can hear me, but we were cut off. But I think the word you were going to add was security. I'm going to turn to the students in Public Affairs 411 and ask if any of them have a question for our panelists. And if you do, to please identify yourself and where you are at the university.
University of Illinois.
Yes, now I can get, yes, please.
Yes.
Okay, hi. I'm just wondering, kind of another part of the discussion that we haven't had yet for the American reaction is not that every American is being spied upon, but it's select Americans who are being spied upon. In other words, there's some sort of discrimination going on possibly, especially post 9/11. So we see Americans, if they're from the Middle East, or their families are from the Middle East, or they're Muslims, or they look Arab, that those are the most likely people to be spied upon. And I think that would help us kind of explain the American outrage at the issue more. So I just wanted to ask if anyone had any opinions on not the idea of everyone being spied upon, but certain groups being spied upon. And that's really the outrageous aspect of this conversation.
Professor Harris.
I can speak to that. There is focused attention from the security services and sometimes even from local police on many of the groups that you name. Some will use the label profiling for this. Others will call it intelligence gathering. I recall that when former President George Bush took office, he made a public pledge in his very first public address to end what was then called profiling, racial profiling, thought about as focusing on African Americans. He would end it in this country. Then came 9/11. 2 years later, the administration of President Bush issued guidelines for that kind of focusing, and it explicitly excluded the use of profiling for security, for national security purposes. And 5 years into the Obama administration, that has not changed, though there has been an opportunity to change those guidelines from within the executive branch. So there's no doubt that it is happening. I will leave to others the appropriateness of whether that's happening. I certainly have my own doubts about its effectiveness. What we know is that by factoring, say, racial or ethnic appearance into enforcement efforts, the efficacy, the ability to get to the right people who actually pose a danger, that ability of law enforcement and intelligence services shrinks back the more that they include a focus or even just a consideration of these kinds of ethnic factors. They are much more likely to be accurate and to do service in our intelligence efforts if they focus on behavior and communication. For that reason, I have to say, I have to correct Professor Glees. I don't think that everybody is being spied upon. I think maybe he was attributing that view to me when I was trying to express what many Americans feel, rightly or wrongly. And I certainly do not believe Edward Snowden is a hero. That's my personal belief. I think he has done incalculable damage to our ability to fight off our real enemies. So we have a very difficult set of decisions to make in this country. It's an ongoing debate. If Snowden has done us one service, it is to push this debate into the sunlight so we can have it. I think that is probably his only service, and I think he went way too far in order to make it happen.
Professor Pedahzur.
Focusing on terrorism here, and terrorism is inconsequential. We have to remember that when we talk about national security, we are talking about much bigger issues. And, as was mentioned earlier, if the U.S. and Europe are going to sign a treaty and are going to find a way not to spy on one another, of course, it's not going to make any difference for Russia or for China, etc. So I think that we are overstating terrorism. Terrorism is exactly all about making a lot of noise but very little damage. And to the question that was raised about ethnic profiling, etc., there are two ways to address it. First, if we want to make a big deal out of terrorism and we have limited resources, the only reasonable thing to do is to narrow the population that you are going to focus on. I don't know, I have no internal information regarding the extent to which the US is spying on, residents or citizens of various descents. But I find it, completely absurd when I see people randomly selected by TSA officers, and they are clearly not, an 8-year-old woman who is a born and raised American. Just this random selection that tries to be so constitutional and fair and politically correct is doing the exact opposite. It's just ridiculous. So that's my response.
Professor Glees.
Would like to dispute the notion that there's profiling going on. I don't think that is the way it is done. Data is collected, metadata is collected, and then subject to certain probes and filters that produce or don't produce results, contacts, telephone numbers, and so forth. They don't go after individuals in that way. it's looking at the thing quite the wrong way round. But what this really proves is that there is a need not just for understanding, but for greater education. And before you have understanding, you need people to be educated so that they know exactly what is being done in their name by professionals who are hopefully well trained, and I think these days they are well trained to do this thing properly. And when the professor there says, Professor Pedahzur says, terrorism makes a lot of noise but little damage, that gives entirely the wrong impression, I'm afraid. There are lots of terrorists out there. In the United Kingdom, we're told by the head of the security service, there are thousands of Islamists, and ever more coming back from Syria. That they, yes, indeed, do little damage is thanks to our alert security community. But the bottom line is, please, we need more education. If Frau Merkel really believes that the European nations can have some kind of internet to which the NSA or GCHQ in Cheltenham there will not have access, she simply does not understand the nature of modern communications. And therefore, she too needs to be educated. A free world in which there are no secrets is actually a much safer world than a world in which there are lots of secrets. So the people should not be afraid of professional intelligence gathering. They should understand it. And the final point is, we talk about commercial, and I think some very important points have been made by Professor Bendiek about the commercial aspect of this. But again, please let's be naive. In Britain, if you look on the internet for a new sofa or a new shirt, you are immediately bombarded by companies throughout the world with offers of sofas and shirts. How do they, these are commercial companies. How do they know you've been searching for this? We've got to get real. If you want absolute privacy, don't communicate.
Yes, I see a person with a hand raised in Florida. Please identify yourself and ask your question. I can't hear you yet.
They need to unmute themselves.
You need to unmute.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay. I don't know. I think, of course, to have technological sovereignty, I'm not convinced that this is the right way to go, because it's also a long-term project, and we have seen how much money has been put in building up Silicon Valley here in the US, and I'm not so sure if the Europeans have really the courage to put so much money and investments in building up a kind of European IT Airbus. And I'm not convinced that this is the right way to go when we would like to continue to live here in the Western liberal order system. But nevertheless, I think it's competition, and is in any way good. And in the sense that I think it's a good idea, which was taken by the Deutsche Telekom to build up a kind of internet with Schengen routing, because it puts a little bit economic pressure also on US companies. And you don't have to forget that the current internet governance system is completely ruled, and in the end, of US companies and the US government in the end, because it's linked really very much to the US Department of Commerce. And the question of legitimacy is coming here into the play too, because I think that other countries, it's not only Germany, it's also a country like Brazil, which is questioning this structure of internet governance at the moment, which is on the bottom line of what we are discussing at the moment, because this provides the US the ground for doing what it does at the moment. And therefore, I think, to sum it up, I think competition is good. So several ideas which are popping up now is not a bad thing, and it should be discussed. And it can, in the end, it can be good and a step forward for the continuation of what we call the liberal order of the Western world. And therefore, I would not reject this idea.
University of Miami, are you unmuted?
Yes, it is working.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Hi, my name is Denzel Alvarado. I'm a student of International Relations at Florida International University. And I had a question. I would like to know if you, the panelists, believe that as a result of Mr. Snowden's actions, that a possible European Union policy or group of people could be elected to review the intelligence capabilities throughout Europe.
Did everybody hear the question? Let me repeat it if I understand it for Dr. Bendiek, that your question is, as a result of Edward Snowden's revelations, is it possible that the European Union would find itself with people in a position of power to review all intelligence operations? Is that the correct question? As a result of that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, Professor Glees.
Yeah, it's a very good point, a very good question. In the United Kingdom, our own Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament is in the process of conducting a major inquiry into basically the public trust in our intelligence agencies. Ask people like me to make written submissions. Anybody that wants to read my submission can do so. It's published on the university website. The question is important because the right way to restore public confidence and legitimacy in work that I believe is absolutely vital is through effective oversight, indeed through aggressive oversight. And I've proposed to our own Intelligence and Security Committee that it reform itself to put far greater distance between itself and the secret intelligence community in the United Kingdom. There is excellent intelligence cooperation within the European Union. Most people don't know this. There's even an organization called INTCEN, the Intelligence Center, which does marvelous work on sharing intelligence. There is no oversight at the moment. There is no oversight of that activity in the European Parliament. European parliamentarians are far too busy squabbling about ridiculous things so they haven't turned their attention to this. But yes, there needs to be a look at this. But what I would say to our colleague there who asked this very important question is, the bottom line is this: secret intelligence, and in the United Kingdom and Europe, intelligence always means secret intelligence. In the United States, intelligence is any information that goes to the government. Secret intelligence is about secretly getting hold of the secrets of your adversaries. And so there's always going to be a barrier between what the public can know about it and what is done. So oversight, an audit. Please, somebody tell Frau Merkel to turn back the volume a bit. She doesn't understand. I don't think she actually understands, where the Gmail server is. That's in the United States. I simply don't think she understands that. Needs to be explained, and everybody needs to draw breath and move towards these questions that Professor Bendiek has put so clearly and importantly about how we legitimate something that is perforce secret, but should not be at all anything less than lawful and consistent with what the European Convention on Human Rights says. Thank you.
Professor Pedahzur, I would fail in my obligations if I didn't take advantage of your expertise to ask two questions. One, information, and one, what you might call snarky. Let me start with the first. If there's any country in the world which knows about terrorism and being in the crosshairs of its enemies, while at the same time trying to achieve democracy, it's Israel. How does the Israeli government, more importantly, negotiate these difficult challenge between listening to your enemies, listening to your friends, spying on your own people, spying on enemies within your own people, and yet maintaining credibility and security? That's my information question. My snarky question is the following. Jonathan Pollard has been in prison in the United States for more than a decade, convicted of spying for Israel on the United States, one ally spying on another. And there was great outrage, and he's been turned down for pardons multiple times. And here we are now revealing that the United States is spying on its friends, or at least listening to its friends' conversation. How can the United States maintain its credibility in its relations and its position while upholding both of those positions?
I'll start with the second question because Jonathan Pollard has been sitting in jail for over 30 years, or almost 30 years now. And it's important to remember that the information that he gave the Israeli government was not, about U.S. national security. It was more related to Middle Eastern issues. It's also important to know that Israel has a very clear regulation about spying in the U.S. Jonathan Pollard was working for a rogue agency that does not exist anymore. It was the Israeli Technological Nuclear Collection Agency that took an opportunity to work with him, and it was not something that was, supported by neither the Shin Bet nor the Mossad. So this was a very sad case, but it takes me back to the first point. You look at Israel, you look at the U.S. Who needs whom more? And this is the question. The U.S. can do whatever it wants, and no one can tell, especially not Israel that is so dependent on the U.S., cannot tell the U.S. what to do. It's not polite or not even smart for the smaller party to try and do the same thing for the hand that feeds it. So in this respect, this is not an issue of law or manners, it's an issue of international power. As for the first question, I don't think that Israel is doing a very good job at adhering to democratic principles while trying to respond to terrorism. And this is something that we have to take into consideration. Israel is actively engaged in ethnic profiling. Israel is, there is no secret about the usage of any piece of information against Israeli citizens, against residents of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, etc., etc. Israel takes any opportunity to counter terrorism at the expense of democratic principles. At the same time, it's important to remember, and I think that it was brought up several times, that most Israelis don't care. Once you see the first suicide bomber goes off, you start caring far less about your own privacy and much more about, opening your bag and being scanned. It's something that became very natural to many Israelis during the Second Intifada. So I think that when we think about democratic principles, it's very contextual. What Americans are unwilling to even consider could change easily under different circumstances. And in Israel, the issue of security became so imminent and so important that people were just willing to give up simple liberties for the hope that this would give them better security. And just to give a simple illustration, shopping malls in Israel have always been better secured than any other facility. No suicide attack ever took place in a shopping mall. So it shows that, you can be very effective, but it comes with a price.
Indeed, and your point to generalize to earlier discussion is echoed by what we've heard today, which is that in different societies, there are different orientations. Professor Glees said this right away. The British have a different view than many Americans. The Germans, you'll see in every column a reference to the Germans and Frau Merkel's special concern about security. I would only add, I always worry about discussions which lump societies together all at once. I think there really is no American societal view. There are multiple views, and different groups assert themselves at different times. Sometimes they're muted by, let's say, what happened at 9/11, only to surface. There are groups that hold privacy as the most important, and others that say privacy is an asset we can't afford. And that debate will take place within the United States, and crucially, it will take place among our allies, as we've heard today. I'm conscious of the time and the commitment each of you have made to be here, and I want to thank you for your participation, especially those of you for whom it's beginning to be late at night in Berlin and in the UK. And I want to thank you all. Thank you, Pia, and Annegret, and Anthony, and Ami, and my colleague David Harris. I want to thank the students at Florida International, Miami, and at Illinois, and our students here at the University of Pittsburgh. I hope you enjoyed and learned something, and perhaps we can call on you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.